Once more on the programme, here I am on the outskirts of Nailsea in the countryside, and with me the mole catcher Bob Woodbury. Bob, I wanted to talk a bit more about the lifestyle of the mole. How much area would a typical mole have? I mean, how big would their system of tunnels actually be?
Well, they do live solitary lives. They can't stand each other's company. They will fight to the death, but you will get a male will overlap with 2 or 3 females. But in general, one mole can occupy anything up to half an acre and can put up anything up to 20 molehills in 24 hours. So it's always very difficult sometimes to tell exactly how many moles are in a piece of ground, because the molehills are a sign of 2 things really, either enlarging its territory or spring cleaning its tunnels. If it needs to do neither of those things, then in fact you won't see fresh molehills, but the moles could still be there underground, but you will see just the odd 1 or 2 molehills being made.
How quickly can they move through the ground?
Well, but I don't know how people know this, but they reckon that they can travel at about 2 miles an hour. I don't know who's actually timed them going through their tunnels, but there was a guy who did some studies back in the 80s who attached some radio equipment to them and was able to monitor them underground. So that, I think, is based on his research.
But they must come across obstacles all the time, gate posts, stones, things that are in the way where they've got to sort of navigate round them.
Yeah, and in fact that's one of the things. They've got this spatial awareness which is tremendous apparently, because bear in mind that the whole of their world has been created by them, and therefore they're perfectly well aware of every twist and turn. And this is where it becomes sometimes difficult for the mole catcher, because they will, if they can detect the trap that you put in the ground, then they come up against it. They will in fact stop and fill it with soil. And it's always more difficult to catch moles in sandy soil where they have no obstacles that they're normally pushing against, like roots or stones or anything like that, obstacles. So one of the arts about catching the mole is in fact to be there, put your traps in, and let the mole not be aware you're there.
In fact, I was reading that the Romans used to put water traps in for moles, and they couldn't smell the human scent on the clay because, you know, it disguises it well, because they're pretty tricky customers, moles, aren't they? They can be elusive.
Yeah, I mean, I've come across some super moles in the past that have taken me anything up to 6 weeks to catch. Not every day.
This is the mole equivalent of Superman,
yeah,
then, is
absolutely, absolutely, and they are very, very tricky. One of the things about the mole, because it lives in its own environment, it's very careful to ensure that there's nothing of any foreign nature in there. The human scent in particular, and even traps which we use, most of us professional mole catchers will ensure that the traps are well weathered. We put them in the ground for 6 weeks before we even use them, and they have to be adjusted very finely so that when the mole touches them, in fact, they do get sprung. But human scent is one of the things, which is why I always wear some rubber gloves so that there's no human scent in the runs. And you have to work quite quickly, because they apparently are able to tell a change in air pressure or light coming in. And they reckon actually that they can survive underground in an atmosphere of only 6% oxygen, which apparently is half that which we need. So there we are.
What do they feed on?
Earthworms and grubs, almost entirely earthworms and grubs. And in the spring, just before now really, when the females have been having the young, what the female would do is go round the runs and actually catch earthworms, take their heads off and store them. And remember that the tunnels, in fact, are the only reason the tunnels are there is to catch the worms. That's the whole purpose of the tunnels, so that they can in fact have their food supply. And again, this guy who did this study many years ago maintained that they work 4 hours on and 4 hours off through 24 hours a day, and they don't hibernate.
A while ago you mentioned the spatial awareness of the mole, and if they've got a large territory with many, many different tunnels, they've got to remember where they've stored bits and bobs, and that memory is completely locked in their own head, isn't it? And it's incredible the way they can recall it.
Yeah, I don't think there is, because of the nature of the creature, much by way of scientific study that's been done on them. But you would have thought for such a small creature how it's got that ability is amazing. And of course, a number of times my hands are in the ground in the mole tunnels, never ever come across a mole, so they obviously get right out of the way. But I have walked up, I'm obviously walking around molehills all the time, walked up to molehills regularly, and you see the molehill moving, and the moment that the mole feels your feet across the ground, it stops.